Right, good morning, everybody. I've just started recording, so thank you all for joining us for our March leaf surgery. It's great to have you all here. It's also great to see in the UK we've got the sun shining a bit more today after a pretty stormy day yesterday. We've got a really good discussion subject and some great guests today, so I'm hoping that we are going to get some really good discussion around this important subject. I'd ask that any questions, please pop them in the chat and we will do our best to filter those as we go through. And we've recording today's session. It will be available a couple of weeks on YouTube and hopefully as an audio only podcast as well. So we're looking forward to that. So big subject today, and really we are seeing more and more interest in this subject. It's clear that the sort of crucial role farming plays in climate resilience, nature recovery is more and more evident, and that's throughout the supply chain. And so the discussion around establishing a starting point and measuring impact is more and more applicable. And we see that at farm level, landscape level, throughout the supply chain, and also in the private and public finance sectors as well. So this morning, we're hoping to delve in a little bit more detail into this subject, and we're lucky to be joined by two experts in this area. So I feel privileged to have the discussion. As we try and do with everything at Leaf, we always want to try and keep the sort of the views and the needs of farmers and growers at the centre of that discussion. And so we'll keep trying to bring things back to that as we go along. But this morning, we're joined by Sarah Haynes, who's Head of Sustainability at the Institute of Grocery Distribution, and also by Carolien Samson, who joins us from Oxbury Bank. So we're really lucky to have these guys. I'm going to hand over to them both in turn for a little bit more detail and introduction on themselves and also their organisations and probably where they come at in relation to this subject. And then we'll get into a little bit more detail after that. So Carolien, I'm going to hand over to you first, if that's all right, for a bit more of an introduction to yourself and Oxbury.
Morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. Even I can see some sunshine from Chester. I'm based in Chester, and I'm the head of sustainable banking for Oxbury Bank. Oxbury was founded in 2018 and started operating as a commercial bank, fully licensed commercial bank in 2021. We are the UK's only bank that is fully focused on the rural economy, and we have lent what is now close to £2 billion to mainly farmers since 2021. We have more than 60,000 savings customers who entrust their savings with us that we can then lend to farmers to do various things on farm. My previous background, I spent 20 odd years in agricultural finance in South Africa. Did anything from policy making, product development, commodity trading, crop insurance, and lending over that time. And I joined Oxbury in 2022. My current role is anything sustainability related, including measuring and metrics, and some of the baselines that we'll talk about today.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. I think that's an incredible sort of CV around this discussion area. So it's good to get your insights. And Sarah, if you could tell us a little about yourself, your role, and IGD as well, it'd be great.
Of course. And yeah, thank you very much for having me today. Really delighted to speak to you all. So I'm Sarah. I'm Head of Sustainability at IGD. And I would say I'm not an expert in any one area of sustainability, but we kind of cover all things net zero and across the kind of food supply chain and system kind of space. So my background actually before coming to IGD was more in sustainability consultancy. So still in the food world and working with food kind of businesses and supply chains as well. But I will just take a minute to talk a little bit about IGD and the sort of work that we do. So we are a kind of strategic food insight and foresight organisation, and we really work to unite and inspire the industry to deliver a thriving food system. Now, it's always a big question, how do we define what a thriving food system is and what is that made up of? But broadly, our work kind of covers a few key areas. So it includes good growth. So how can we look at opportunities for economic growth of UK food? Sustainability and the transition to net zero and the nature emergency as well. Health, so looking at kind of population diet and the Eat Well guide and the kind of shifts that will need to be made now and in future years. And then also workforce, so how we can make sure that really the food industry has a workforce that is kind of fit for the future. But what I think is kind of interesting is not necessarily the sort of topics of work that we do, but actually the type of work that we do. So we are a charity and we're totally self-funded by our kind of commercial work. But what that means is that we are totally independent and we do have that kind of total food system coverage. So we're well placed to kind of convene and look at pre-competitive collective action across areas that kind of matter the most, where individual businesses or individual sectors can't make progress towards a thriving food system themselves. So yeah, a lot of what we do is kind of in that space, working with businesses, convening for collective action, and sustainability and baselining is one of the things that we have been looking at most recently that I'm very happy to kind of dive into a bit more detail on when it helps.
Thank you, Sarah. And there's a lot of sort of similarities and parallels there, really, with IGD and Leaf and the areas that we work in. Just while we've you, one reason that really sort of kicked off our thoughts on this discussion were following the publication of your recent report, the value case for baseline in England's farmland. And whilst, yeah, it's country specific, in the case of the report, there's lots of learnings from there that we can extrapolate out to other areas. Could you tell us a little bit more about that report?
Yeah, absolutely. So we published the report just before Christmas that many of you may have seen, but I'm sure many of you also haven't. I'm happy to kind of share around a link after this if that's possible. But essentially, we always kind of hear about the importance of having an environmental baseline to understand, where are we now and how can we best kind of capture improvements going forward. But the reality is, when we talk about farm environmental baselining, everybody across the system needs very different things from that baselining and needs different things from the data. And we sort of were, exploring what do we need for progress here, and actually taking some inspiration really from the work that has happened in Northern Ireland around the kind of national approach to baselining. We're thinking, what needs to happen across England to kind of extend that and to get to a place where there really is a national level approach to collecting farm environmental data for a baseline that is at scale. So the work that we have been doing is really about how can we build a value case that outlines the opportunity that baselining could bring to the system. And it's really looking beyond what might be seen as a kind of typical, more pure environmental perspective, but actually starts to bring in, how can baselining be helpful from a kind of economic efficiency point of view? How could it support environmental improvements, but also how can it contribute to kind of longer term national resilience as well? So it's providing a much kind of broader lens from what we might typically see in kind of the conversations around baselining. And just to build on that as well, it's also bringing together lots of different stakeholders from across the system. So we were lucky enough to have a lot of input into that initial report. Yes, we've been speaking to kind of the food industry and retailers and manufacturers, but we've also been speaking to farmers, and we've done some research to bring in kind of farmer insights to the work. We've been speaking to Carolien and others from the kind of banking and finance sector, landowners, and the list kind of goes on. So what typically we might see through a lens of maybe environment and through a lens of a single perspective, the work in the report has really tried to kind of bring together that systems approach, the system opportunities, under a single kind of view. So I'll stop there for now, and I'm sure there'll be lots more to tease out in some of the questions through today, but hopefully that just gives a sense of the type of work that we've been doing.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a great report. We'll put a link to the report in the chat so people can access that. And whilst there's quite a lot of high level things in there, the sort of national baselining, there is also elements of granularity in there and the farmer side of things. And I think when we think about baselining, and we think about it from a farmer perspective, sometimes it isn't always clear what that might deliver at farm level, and we'll hopefully get on even down to field level and things in a bit. But Carolien, I'm really interested from an Oxbury perspective, and maybe some case studies and examples, how you feel it might benefit farmers directly. We can see how it can possibly benefit along supply chains, and how a national view is a really useful thing to have. But I know you have lots of experience with some of your clients and your transition facility about actually how it can directly benefit farmers on the ground as well.
So I'll answer this in two, Dan, I think. So I'm just first going to explain why we care about baselining, and then how we share that with our customers with a really practical example. So as I remind people, we're a bank. We're lending to farmers, and our maximum loan term is 25 years. My average loan term at this point is 21 years. So when people start talking about extreme weather events and changes in weather patterns and changes in supply chain requirements, we are very much lending into that space. So we know these changes are going to affect farmers. We can't predict when that will happen. We can't predict necessarily how that will happen. But what we can do is we can try and look at farmers in the current condition and state where they are, and try and identify what practices they're undertaking that will build resilience for them into this longer term position. And so when we start looking at baselining, it's with that kind of intent in mind that we do it. And what we've done to date has been to focus on two specific elements around that. First one being farmer emissions, so operational emissions, because we know there are expectations around emissions reductions. And then the other one has been looking at soil organic carbon as a proxy for soil health. We know that as farmers build soil organic carbon, they will be able to store more water, water can infiltrate better, and that's an indication that whether it's too much rain or too little rain, a farm will be in a better position than it might have been. So as part of that, one of the elements in our transition facility has been to undertake soil organic carbon baselines for farmers, where we can actually see their history. And I was on farm last week with one of our customers, and because we know the customer well, we also know what practices they've been implementing. So this is a farm just north of London. It's an arable farm that do cereal production, and because of where they're located, they've introduced practices like menthol quite a long time ago. They've been doing that for 10 years. But this is a farmer who started experimenting with cover crops in 2021, 2022, starting to put those cover crops in place. And I've been able to sit with him last week and go through his soil organic carbon numbers, and we can see how, as his practices have changed, his soil organic carbon levels have improved. And what was absolutely spectacular was when we realized that despite the drought that he was in last year, which was as bad as his 22 drought, as bad as his 2020 drought, his soil organic carbon levels was maintained. And so we can start pulling a link between the practices that he's implementing and what he's experiencing on farm. And we can track that back down to productivity, so we can go look at his crop yields. And so sharing this with the farmer means that he can, it's not just a requirement that he does this. We can actually start looking at how does this influence his actual business. And because we've got carbon emissions, we can work with him then to put together a picture for a supply chain partner about what their trajectory on that is. And so they can benefit from having the information and then bringing it into other elements. In this case, we sat with the farmer with his harvest maps and his soil samples, soil health samples, and just combined everything. We spent like 2 hours being very nerdy and soil focused, I have to admit.
That's brilliant. So from that data, actually, you're delivering back not only access to different products, in your case, financial, delivering back insights in that case. And I guess by linking that to practice data, which we are a massive fan of at Leaf, you can then deliver insights that can be shared through knowledge exchange as well. And it can bring about greater change in the industry. But also that data that's then available is able to be used in other areas, both in terms of business planning, but throughout the supply chain as well.
Yeah, that's very much our intention.
Yeah, brilliant. So it's great to see the value there. And it's also good to have an understanding from an Oxbury perspective that you've chosen, all right, we're going to look at soil organic carbon and we're going to look at emissions data as well. And so we're not necessarily going to shotgun it. It will be more focused.
I mean, we're slowly building our understanding of different measures. The same farmer had bird sensors, acoustic sensors over Christmas on it. I was starting to look at what that tells us and kind of correlate that to the information we have on his soil as well through presence and absence of species.
Brilliant. So, because I think we'd agree, and Sarah, I'm going to pose this question to you, that the data landscape can look quite fragmented. And actually, there's probably not a couple of days that goes by without somebody approaching us at Leaf saying we have this new development in terms of gathering data. We'd love you to tell you about it or get behind it. And that can be quite a confusing sort of landscape, I think, for farmers and growers. And so it'd be good to see how you interpret that fragmented data landscape and maybe talking from sort of retail down, how that sort of works and what your view is and how that might sort of transition in time.
Yeah, absolutely. And right to say that it is fragmented and it feels quite confusing. And there's definitely a need for some consistency, let's say, and some simplification, I think, of a lot of what's out there. I guess, yeah, from my perspective and what we've kind of tried to bring across in the report as well is, there are so many different layers to this and so many different stakeholders that all operate within the same system, but they all have very different needs. So it's almost, starting from a kind of farm perspective, there are, of course, huge benefits that could be had from better environmental data and from a baseline in terms of economic efficiency and profitability, as Carolien has just mentioned, but also kind of looking at behaviour change and that sort of thing. But as we go through the entire system and kind of look at all these different layers, if we were to look at kind of food businesses or at sector level, there are very different needs, for example, reporting on their kind of scope 3 emissions that environmental farm baseline data might be helpful for. If we were then to look at kind of national level, it might be things like, how can we accelerate carbon markets and how can we make sure that investment is directed to the right places by having the right kind of data to show up what's needed. And even looking at kind of an international level, it's, how are we showing up as part of our kind of nationally determined contributions, conversations at COP, that sort of thing. So there's a whole kind of cascade, I guess, of where this environmental information and data and baselining could be used. And across all of those use cases, one of the problems, I think, is that actually there's not really that level of communication yet that is consistent enough. That means a single source or bit of information at farm level could then be used by all of these different actors and stakeholders across supply chains from farm level all the way through to a kind of international level. So that fragmentation is definitely a challenge. And I think what we often see is that there are kind of pockets of really good work and there are needs of stakeholders that are communicated kind of to farms. But because it's not in a joined up way, there are multiple asks. And then we end up in a situation where it can feel quite burdensome, I think, for a number of farmers who are getting, of all those different use cases, different requests for data for each one. So, something we've tried to start pulling together as part of that report is really how can we bring in all of those perspectives and the needs at least into one place and just understand what a kind of shared action plan would look like. But I think it is certainly a challenge, and it's not necessarily that we've got all of the solutions to that yet, but at least having a single place and a single shared plan across the system for what all of the different use cases for this data could be and how they could be communicated more consistently is certainly a starting point, I think.
I would certainly agree with the feeling that people can feel pulled in lots of different directions, and then it can be hard to say, okay, well, what are the really key metrics and what are the key things for my business as well that deliver exactly, as Carolien said, down the supply chain, when actually lots of people are asking for slightly different things in slightly different ways. Well, I'm just going to stay with you for a minute, Sarah. When we talk about the standardization, and we can certainly see the advantages in that, in terms of sort of some standardized metrics, and we can get onto the complications there. Is there a trade-off and a tension there between potentially a loss of granularity? We're applying a standardized metric or a way of recording across lots of different businesses in different sectors and different geographies, and that's data then can be harmonized for use across the supply chain. But can we lose some of the detail and the context in doing that? And how do we sort of square that trade-off?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges in that, and this isn't something that we have an answer to yet. So I would love it if we could have some views from everyone in the room as well on sort of where the thinking has kind of got to. But in our minds and through the work and the kind of consultation that we've done, we actually ended up towards the end of the report with bit of an upside down triangle that kind of explained the options that we might have to go ahead with a national baselining approach. And they go all the way from having an approach that is in lots of detail, real granularity, covers lots of metrics, and is measured at depth. But at the other end of the scale, there are options that are much less granular, quicker to achieve, probably less costly, but may not give us kind of the depth of insight that some of the more detailed approaches might. So there's lots of different options, and for everybody across the system, a different level of granularity and a different level of insight would be needed for different outputs and use cases. So for things like, for example, Scope 3 reporting and carbon credits and that sort of thing, a really high granularity of data is probably needed. Whereas for, some more basic insight and for maybe the kind of national level summary of that information, perhaps a kind of real granular level of information isn't quite so needed. So we essentially find ourselves in a place where it's looking at what is the most kind of cost effective approach, I suppose, that will give the greatest return on investment and will be relevant for the maximum number of use cases across the system, so that a single point of data collection can be used for all. So yeah, I think again, it's one of those where there's not yet an answer, but we have options that need to be teased out as to how can we maximize the number of use cases that the data can be used for. And that will be based on how granular is that data collection, and therefore what can the output be.
Thank you.
Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, it's quite a complicated landscape around granularity and which approach might be best based on who you're speaking to.
Definitely. Yeah, it's certainly complex. I'd be interested to get the sort of Oxbury view as well, Carolien, on that, because I'm guessing this is a sort of series of considerations and discussions you've gone through to decide, all right, well, what metrics are we going to settle on and how are we going to measure those to deliver both at your level and beyond, and also down to farm and even field level and above and below ground that I know we've touched on, just bringing an extra layer of complexity into the question just to make a complicated situation even more so.
I mean, yes, it's an ongoing debate as to how much do you need. And I think there's a real risk in the sector in wanting perfection. So you want the perfect, most complete answer. But quite often that is not useful to make this. It doesn't really support decision making. In that you can go and collect perfection at a very small number of entities, but you can't from that perfection then expand it easily across a large sample. So I do get this quoted back to me by now by people who's listened to me quite often, but my approach has very much been to say, is it scalable? Having 100 perfect data points for 100 farms when I have 6,000 customers isn't useful. Being able to go from 100 to 2,000 is useful. So how scalable is it? How comparable is it? Is it something that I can get irrespective of I get a consistent number all the time? Because again, having a lot of numbers, but you can't really compare them, then they're nice to have, but you need to have too much detail at that point. So scalable, comparable, and consistent. Do I get this annually, every second year, whatever, but what is my cadence in this? And so we have gone quite minimalistic in what we collect, but what we collect, we know can support a number of decisions, and we can scale it. So, for example, maps are kind of key to what we do. When I started in 2022, I went, can we have 4 maps? And now at that point, I was being really strange, according to everybody, to think that this is useful. But 3 years down the line, my relationship managers kind of knows, yes, we'll do a map, because it supports not only the work that I do, but it supports work that they do. It simplifies our credit application because they can share with credit what the flood risk is or whatever it is quite easily. So it's also been around how do we build this within our total business process. So the sustainability team isn't like a little standalone business bolted on the side. We're very much focused on how do we bring this within the overall business process. And I think that's helped. And then the second view that we have on this is a very consistent view that says, so if we have this, how do we share this with the customer? What can we share? How do we share? And that, I think, has been really important in helping us to explain why this data is important. Not only to a small sustainability team where people think, well, it's for the sake of reporting, but it is fundamental to how we make decisions.
Brilliant. There's a bit to unpack there, isn't there? I think actually demonstrating the value of that data to everybody. We're in a different environment, I would hope now, to where we were even 3 years ago talking about that data. And in 2 years' time, hopefully we'll be in an even different place. And that mapping example is great. You're completely right that now that is, an accepted first point, isn't it, in many respects? Coming out of that, there's a couple of related questions, and I'd be really interested to get both of your views on this. So if we were sort of designing a great starter baselining pack for a sort of, let's use a mixed farm in the UK as an example, what might be in that we might present to farmers? And then what are the key enablers to farmers starting with baselining and impact measurement from an environmental perspective? So a bit of an overlap there. Carolien, I'm going to pitch it at you first, if that's all right.
I mean, so what we would go for is land cover. So, and change in land cover. I don't need this to the nth degree, but I need a description of land cover. Soil organic carbon, yield. So information about the crops and the yields. I should have remembered that it is our weekly fire drill moment. So we'll move on. Emissions, so operational emissions. And thereafter, most things is probably optional. That's kind of the base that we'd go with. So, okay. And from a starting point, a map, because you can find stuff on a map.
Brilliant. And that, I mean, that wish list there, Sarah, I'll come to yours in a moment, is applicable across sectors and geographies. So it's not sector specific.
It's not sector specific.
And what would be the key enablers to allow? So a farmer has that list of their starter metrics, and what would be the key enablers, the first sort of place you might direct them to, or the thing that needs to be in place to allow them to do that, do you think?
So one of the things that we find when we do look at soil organic carbon, for instance, is it's interesting. You can derive all kinds of things out of it. Farmers love it because they can point to bits on their farm that they can see change. But for them to be able to use it in the supply chain, they really, really need a carbon footprint. So a starting point carbon footprint is, because again, that you can bring other information in towards that and go, this is how it relates. Start a carbon footprint. As good as you can. It's probably a minimum requirement. And within the carbon footprint, there's all kinds of bits of data that you can use for other things. So like I said, if you want crop and yield, it's going to be in there. So you can pull out some other bits. I mean, I'm a big fan of looking at animal mortality rates. It's a good indication of sustainability on farm.
Brilliant, thank you. So we got a good sort of starter pack there, and also actually that enabler and where you're going to start as a farmer if you're going to do it next week is brilliant. Sarah,
sorry, but then, and I mean, you can make assumptions around this to scale it upwards. There are ways to go, okay, this is a kind of example farm, let's apply it to others.
Yeah, I agree. Sarah, what's your view on a sort of a starter pack of metrics and the enablers for somebody to start doing it next week?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, to be honest, I can probably speak more to the kind of enablers at a slightly higher level. And what's interesting actually from some of the work that we've done is we did conduct some sort of farmer surveys. So we worked with grounded research and actually got some really helpful insight just into, you know, what's the general kind of sentiment from farmers and their kind of view on baselining, and what would need to be true for the environmental data collection to happen in the best way. And I think what we heard was across the system, we kind of hear that actually perhaps farmers are less open to baselining because of things like it feels there's quite a lot of burden, it is complicated around the fragmentation of approaches and that sort of thing. But actually what we found in the surveying was that only about 15% of farmers felt skeptical about baselining and that environmental data collection, and the rest were actually relatively open to it. But there does need to be some really key criteria in terms of the way that it's done. So firstly, there was a lot of feedback around kind of co-design with farmers. So in order to make any data collection and baselining successful, it can't just be a single direct ask from a stakeholder within the supply chain outside of the kind of farming space. It really needs to be an approach that is, sector representatives, industry, government working with farmers to design the best approach, the best metrics, and the way of going about it. So that was a really big takeaway. We need to really listen and work together on it. The other one was really around, how can we show up the commercial and reputational advantages of baselining and environmental data collection. So often, there are questions and asks that come without appropriate context. And I think spending the energy and the time to really outline those opportunities and kind of the business casing for it is really important, because otherwise, it's difficult to understand what this kind of often quite timely data collection can lead to in terms of benefits at that farm level. And then another really big area was just around governance, and actually, as the data is collected, how can we make sure that the governance mechanism for the kind of flow of that data and the use of that data to other stakeholders across the system is really clear, really transparent, and it's fair for farmers as well. So I think there are a few kind of overarching principles, I guess, before we get into any of the detail, that is just really important in terms of how it's constructed and how those conversations with farmers happen to build out the best approach. So yeah, I guess that's more on the enablers. And then from a metrics perspective, there has obviously been quite a lot of progress on carbon, but recognise carbon is not the only metric that we should be looking at. There's obviously a big move.
Hi, Richard Jenner.
Carbon removals.
Yeah, good, thank you. Not too bad.
And we, actually with kind of carbon removals and carbon sequestration, there are huge benefits that kind of flow through the supply chain as well. So that's where there's most complexity, I suppose, around the way that that's measured at the moment. But there is brilliant work happening. So, for example, the AHDB baselining pilot has looked at carbon removals and what perhaps the best approach might be to kind of measure those. So we're getting closer, I think, to having more information about what good looks like from a carbon removals perspective. And then, yeah, I think beyond that, there are many other metrics that we could and should be capturing, but it's probably from our side a kind of what's the right sequence of doing that. Everything all at once might feel like quite a lot and be quite costly. But if there's kind of a pragmatic approach to looking at metrics over time, then that could be a good option. Yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that's great. And I think those enablers that you identified in your work, I mean, they can be translated across so many different subjects, can't they? Actually, that co-design element and the context is really important. It's interesting to know that the sort of level of skepticism was very low, but I think sometimes there can be suspicion there unless the context from the reasons for that data, and exactly as Oxbury and other institutions are doing, delivering that value back to the farmer. They're not thinking, okay, well, this data is being harnessed for things outside of my control, and I don't know how that's going to be used and how it might impact me going forward. So
yeah, and I might just add to that quickly as well, if you don't mind, that in the research we did with grounded research, we made sure that there was kind of sector representation. So we heard from lots of different types of farmers and farming sectors, and actually there is huge variation based on which sector we're looking at. And there are things like, you know, for example, the level of integration that there might be. There are things like, you know, what's the actual emissions reduction potential of certain sectors, and are there sort of external pressures and kind of governance mechanisms in place that might influence kind of how progressed or how open we are to baselining. So I think it's just important that it's not a kind of one size fits all, and actually every sector is at a very different stage. And where we look at, for example, the dairy sector, that's probably one of the examples of where there's been most progress, because there's some really well thought out governance there. And actually it's been a kind of, yeah, a really well established approach. But other sectors, for various reasons, will be a little bit further behind, and it may be newer, talking about environmental data collection and baselining. So I think it's important just to get down into the nuance of, you know, it's not just a one size fits all for the system, but actually it's there is an openness, but it does vary based on who we're talking to and what kind of sector it's relevant for.
yeah, and I was going to ask you which sectors you felt were developed in this area without saying, you know, this sector is better, in inverted commas, this sector is worse. It's actually, well, here's a sector for various reasons might be a bit further on that journey, and what can we all learn from that? And it's interesting, the dairy example, definitely. If we were to look ahead sort of 10 years or so, get our best fortune telling heads on and look at what sort of the farm level baselining and impact measurement world looked like in 10 years, and Sarah from a supply chain and Carolien from a sort of finance sector perspective, it'd be really good to get your views about what good looks like in 5-10 years time. Carolien, can I pose that to you first from a finance perspective, what your wish list might be?
My wish, I mean, I think, well, I hope, and looking at the technology, we should be able to get there. I think what we'll see is that we'll need to measure less, because we'll be able to harness technology to efficiently collect a minimal range of indicators that then supports the wider measurement and monitoring process, hopefully with a lot less effort from the farmer, supporting them with sensors and things, so that they can get on with doing what they should be doing, which is producing food, and the rest of it will be hopefully a lot less intrusive in their lives. But at the same time, being able to then give them information back in a decision useful format. Because I think the one other challenge that we have at the moment. I was with a different customer the other day, and his farm has been used for many versions of anything that's measured, it ends up on his farm at some point. And he's now got so many measurements and at various points that he's starting to go, okay, so which of these actually matter? So I think we will hopefully be at a point where it's a limited number. It doesn't rely on the farmer as much as we do at the moment. And because the technology is there, we'll be able to share it consistently with appropriate permissions. I also think that what we're going to see is that the supply chain is going to get better at asking for the same thing. I'm definitely seeing some movement around that. So I'm hoping we'll get that also much smoother.
Brilliant. So hopefully if that pans out as we would hope, the future looks bright, doesn't it, in terms of the data we're able to collect and the effort required to collect that, minimal duplication. And the really important bit you struck on there is how that loop is completed back to the farmer. So it needs to inform management decisions rather than collecting data for data's sake.
I mean, I think the other piece of the puzzle that's arrived has been the land sector removal standard, because that's going to force long-term thinking onto everybody. You're not going to be able to be in and out as randomly. So I think the long-term thinking that will bring to the supply chain will drive the need to improve these efficiencies quite quickly.
And Sarah, from your perspective and a supply chain perspective, what does good look like in 5 to 10 years? What do you see the future panning out like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd be excited to kind of stand in the future and see where we get to. But I think I guess top of my mind, and because it's kind of the work that we're looking at the moment, is in 5-10 years time, it would be brilliant if we could have a single baseline that we're all working from across the system. So we're actually looking to deliver the next phase of the value case work to government, putting forward a kind of economic case for that national scale baselining to be done. But I think what's important, and where we do need to get to quite quickly, is not just to look at baselining and data collection in isolation, but actually having a single shared view and plan that brings together that single baseline along with mechanisms for the kind of data sharing and governance across the system, but also the sort of incentives piece will be really important. So I would love in 10 years time if we could look back and say, actually, you know what, we've avoided some of that kind of fragmentation and more of that kind of splintered approach. And actually there's a single plan that brings together the baselining, the management of the data and the incentives piece together. And, you know, there's lots of good work that's already happening to contribute to each of those elements. But ideally in 10 years time we will look back and they will all kind of coalesce and be working together. But yeah, really agree with everything that Carolien said, in that there needs to be a mechanism for reducing burden and kind of single asks that flow up and down supply chains that's really trusted for everybody.
Brilliant, thank you. And you know, bringing things to a close and summarising, you've both made me feel incredibly positive about this world going forward, how the future looks. And I think what has come through as we've discussed it is how important farmers and growers at the centre of things are, and ensuring that any data delivers back to people on the ground as well and informs management decisions. I think the place we're in, the context we're in now, is a hell of a lot better than we were even a few years ago. And so if that positivity, that momentum continues and we get more joined up, thinking across the supply chain and sectors, then we're going to be in a really good place when we come and revisit this subject in 10 years time and we look back on our predictions and see how well we've done. And I think that will be brilliant. But I'd just like to thank both Sarah and Carolien for your time. We really appreciate this. To be able to get into the weeds of this type of subject is great. And I'm sure we could have carried on for ages. We've put the report on the chat there for people to go and have a look at. And I am sure we will pick this subject up again. Our next surgery is on the 10th of April. We are talking about climate smart dairy in that instance, so it'd be great to see many of you there. But thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next time.